Hi darling, I'm over here. Down the garden. Yeah, you've got to get your shoes on. Oh, g'day shakers and groovers, how are you going today? Sorry for interrupting, I have a story to tell. I started that review when there was no such thing as a Z7, didn't exist. There was the D850, which I had, and there was the A7R III, which I got because I looked at Panasonic, I looked at Fuji, I looked at Canon, I looked all over the place to try and decide what camera would be best for me to do my photography and my vlogging. What would allow me to do both. Still using the D850s for the serious stuff, but having a camera that was an all-rounder. So the A7R III was it. That's what I decided, that's what I rested on. 42 megapixels instead of 45, went very well, great companion with the D850s. Couldn't exactly natively use all of my many Nikon 15 odd lenses. I just wanted to use it for vlogging mostly and stills at other times. And here it is. There it is right there. That is the camera that we're talking about, the A7R III. So it was July and it was like, okay, great, I'll get it. There is no other option. The Nikon, which was of course was rumored to be coming at the end of 2019 at the time, it's like, that's okay, 18 months, that's plenty of time, no worries. I'll get something in the meantime, and who knows what the Nikon mirrorless might be like. We had no idea. And as I was shooting this very film that you've been watching, as I was shooting it, the Z7 was announced. The specs came out, and suddenly everything changed. And it really did look on paper like it was going to be a bit of a game changer from my perspective, relative to the Nikon universe. Not relative to the entire camera industry, relative to the Nikon universe. In essence, it had the same sensor in it, and in essence, it natively took lenses. In essence, I could use the same batteries of which I have with my D800Es, my D810, my D850s, all the same batteries, all the same chargers. Use the same flashes that I own, same flash system. All that stuff was compatible, which of course with the Sony I would have to start all over again. And this changed everything. Now, there were certain people online who said, what the hell are you talking about? One minute you like Sony and the next minute you like Nikon. Not at all. I need to be very clear about that. It's not that the Sony isn't amazing. The Sony is amazing. Everybody knows it. No one can argue with that fact at all. But the Nikon's pretty damn good. And I reckon for a first gen, it's 80–90% of the way there. And for a Nikon person, well, it has a whole bunch of advantages. And then there's some things that the Nikon actually does better than the Sony. The ergonomics are better, the viewfinder is better, and I actually think the mount is even more future-proofed. Shorter flange distance and larger. Going to be some really interesting things that come from this. So how does this affect my A7R III versus the D850 review? Well, let's still watch that, and in the coming months I'll throw the Z7 in the mix and we can talk about all three of them. Jump on back to the scheduled programming and I hope you enjoy it. But the Z7 will be coming as part of this mix. Thank you. The other thing I forgot to say is this is being shot on the Z7 in 4K. It's looking good so far. Face Detect actually works unlike the D850, which was completely unreliable and spent its whole life hunting. Strange thing happened on the way to the opera. Yes, the D850, then the A7R III, and then the Z7. I'm going to compare the D850 and the A7R III closely. Which one does what better? And what do I think about them as a professional camera? Having been a professional for 29 years. How does it work? How does it look? How do they go? Look at this beautiful, absolutely beautiful landscape I'm in here. We're in the Mediterranean basically, and we're steaming. Yeah, at a fair clip, probably 20 knots or something like that. So yeah, I want to talk about the A7R III real world use. I've been using it at night. I've been shooting 4K, 1080p, high speed, and higher ISOs using the 24 to 105. That's the only lens I had with me. I wanted to travel light on this trip and see if I could get away with it. I'm going to talk about the ergonomics. I'm going to talk about image quality. I'm going to talk about the 24 to 105 and how it fits, and my opinion. What do I think of this camera? How do I think of it versus the D850, and how do I think of it on its own? Let's jump into that. Well, it's a really, really good camera. I'm really impressed. I'm really impressed. And what are these? Alrighty, well, let's stop right there. So much has changed since I recorded this vision. The Nikon Z7 has become not just a rumor, but a reality. We can see it's a contender for the same space that the A7R III sits in. So what I want to do right now is talk about how the A7R III differed from the D850 and why I went out and bought one of these things, because it did things that the D850 did not do. There are three things that I felt it was either superior at or simply did that the D850 did not do. Firstly, electronic viewfinder. Now, an electronic viewfinder has its advantages and disadvantages, and I want you to watch this little clip that I recorded a few weeks ago about that.
So, what are some of the obvious differences between an optical viewfinder and an electronic viewfinder? We're obviously talking about the high megapixel 35mm space. Well, you can set it up so what you're seeing through the viewfinder is the photograph that you take. It means you don't have to take your eye off the viewfinder and have a look at what your results are, because you've already seen it when you took the shot. So it's something I've never really had before, and I think I'm liking it. I think it makes things faster. There is a reflex to go and look at things sometimes if you're unsure, but seeing as I'm only using this camera, and that reflex is starting to disappear.
Another thing I wanted to talk about in regards to EVF versus OVF is this little thing. I've spent my whole career shooting into the sun. I like shooting into the sun. I think it creates pretty interesting effects. But of course, if you're shooting into the sun with an optical viewfinder, you're getting the sun, the real sun, 100% of it, into your eye. And it hurts. Can't do it for long. And it leaves little spots in your eyes that stay there for quite some time. Now, of course, with an electronic viewfinder, that is not a problem at all. It's not a problem. So that's a big advantage for the electronic viewfinder. And all they need to do is just make them better. I'd love it if they made them better. It'd be so good. So good. Next, in-body stabilization. Now, I think in-body stabilization is a great thing. I've found that the Nikon in-lens stabilization, VR as they call it, just doesn't match what IBS does ironing out the bumps. It just doesn't seem to have the same latitude. And you see this more in video making, and you don't notice it all in stills. I think the VR for the Nikon lenses is fantastic for stills, but I just don't think it's designed for video making. Whereas the Sony IBS is made for video making and it does a better job. So that is another place where I think the Sony is superior. And then finally, the focusing system in the Sony when shooting video is superior. Only when shooting video is it superior. As I've talked about before, and I'll talk about again, the ability to be able to video yourself and be comfortable and confident that it's going to work is simply not possible in the D850, but with the Sony works really well. So these were the 3 reasons that I have spent thousands of dollars getting the A7R III body to go in conjunction with my Nikon D850s. And if I had known this information 3 or 4 weeks earlier, that it would be out soon, I would have waited. But that's life in the big city, so I'm okay about that. But I would have waited. So the big question now is, it's not really the D850 versus the A7R III. But today, it's the A7R III versus the Nikon Z7. That's where we're at. I still want to talk about the D850 versus the A7R III, but it feels less relevant now. So I want to talk about image quality now, and to be honest, I don't have a lot to say because there isn't much to say. The A7R III is spectacular. Images shot at 50 and 100 ISO are spectacular. In comparison to the D850 at that level, it's spectacular and they're similar, and we've recently heard that the D850 chip was actually made by Sony. There's only a 3 megapixel difference between them, negligible, and low light performance is similar to the D850 and spectacular. And again, because you have the in-body stabilization, I actually think that ultimately will allow you to get more good, clear, sharp images in more situations than you will with the Nikon. Because of course, sometimes you're going to be shooting a Nikon that's not got VR, and if you're getting into lower shutter speeds, that's going to become a problem. So my thoughts would be ultimately that technically they're very similar cameras. The images are beautiful out of both of them, like outstanding, and ultimately because of the in-body stabilization, just purely statistically, you will get more sharp images from the Sony. Otherwise, if you had them both on a tripod shooting the same thing with the same settings, the difference between them is negligible and you're going to love both. Let's talk about the video image quality, the stills, the motion picture video quality. This is not an area that I'm an expert in, and I would say they're similar. They both have the ability to shoot high frame rate 1080p, which is great, we love that for our B-roll, etc. And they both do 4K, which is fantastic. And you can get 100 megabit 4K on the Sony, which is slightly higher quality. But again, if you're sort of in this space of not wanting to go up to a $10,000 or $20,000 digital video camera, the difference between these two at this price point, when really they're still cameras first and video cameras second, is what I would say with both of these, just due to their ergonomics. Yeah, I would say they're very similar. But of course, back to the point I was making before, ergonomically, the Sony's better, and the optical viewfinder, the Sony's better. So if you're going to be doing a mix of stills and motion pictures, and you're going to be doing some running and gunning, no question, I would say the Sony's the one to go for video. If that's a big part of your world. That's my thought. That's why I bought one. Because it's better at it. Easier to use. Stabilized. Let's talk about high ISO. Well, again, as I said, it's similar to the D850. I'm comfortable shooting these cameras anywhere from 16 to 3200 for my professional work. I start to get a little bit crunchy up there, but I still think it's a look. I still think it works. These days I'm pushing my ISOs as low as possible, just increasing shutter speeds, working towards the VR and my various lenses and the VR and in-body stabilization, ironing things out that way.
I love the dynamic range of low ISO files. They're just spectacular. It really works for me. You can push these things when you want to, and 16 or 32, again, they're very similar. You know, they're very similar chips. You're going to be happy with whatever you're seeing there in regards to high ISO. Flippy screens, well, they both have similar flippy screens. They both tilt. Neither of them allow you to see the screen when you're vlogging like this, so they just tilt for up and down for high and low viewpoints, which I love. I think it's great. The A7R does that. I think it's great. The Nikon does that. It's very useful. It means you don't have to lie in the dirt as often. But the touchscreen on the A7R is very limited, and the touchscreen on the D850 is really good, and I use that touchscreen quite a lot for pinching and zooming and flicking through images and so on. The screen and the touchscreen is superior on the D850. Does that end up being a game changer? Well, I don't think so, because the controls to do the same things on the Sony are all right there. They're all in the same place. You don't have to go far, and it doesn't really take any longer. It's just a bit of a luxury in a way. I still find myself, even on the D850, using the original analog controls rather than using the screen. I don't think it's a game changer at all. So screen-wise, they end up being pretty similar. And you know, I'm not overly interested in talking about how many dots, the actual optical qualities of the screen. They look quite similar. Sony is doing a pretty good job of creating lenses that are pretty similar to their competitors, and they're obviously doing, you know, they're obviously building that at a pretty quick rate, trying to get it all happening, but they've got less. If having a really wide range of original lenses is important to you, more specialty macro lenses and tilt shift lenses, then you want to be getting the Nikon. You don't want to be getting the Sony. You can adapt them. So yes, thank you so much for watching. It's been great to see you. And if you're new to the channel, it'd be great if you subscribed. I'd love it if you liked it. And of course, I really want to hear your thoughts. If you've got an A7R III, how's it going for you? If you've got a D850, how's it going for you? Are you thinking about changing to a mirrorless camera? I certainly think with the A7R III, as a summation, you're going to have no problems with it. If you were to move there now, if you were starting fresh into photography, or it's time for a major upgrade, you're going to be very, very impressed and very, very happy. I still do think, as a stills camera, that the Nikon D850 overall is a better stills camera. Not because of the spec sheet, but just more the ergonomics, the handling, and the way it does focusing with stills. So if you want to be a hardcore stills photographer, it's the one to go with, no question. If you're more of a hybrid shooter, there's a little bit of video and stills, then either of the cameras is great. You can't go wrong. You cannot go wrong with either of the cameras. And if you're a hybrid shooter and vlogging is important, then there's no question to me the A7R III is the one to go with. So they're my thoughts. They're my thoughts. If you're not going to vlog, you can get either camera, and the differences between them are minor. And the only standout difference from my perspective is the lens choices that you have available to you with the Sony, but of course you can adapt them. I haven't gone in depth with the A7R III in adapting them. When I had my original A7R, the adapting wasn't working that well, because at that time in 2013, lenses didn't autofocus and you didn't get any of the metadata and you couldn't stabilize and all those things.
I believe in the intervening years, it's all changed, and you can now get metadata and focus and aperture. So thank you so much for watching the A7R III versus the D850 review, now that we're living in a Z world. I think this review is still valid, but of course there is a third leg to this story. And in the coming weeks, I will bring the Z to this equation and compare all three cameras together. Again, thanks so much for watching. I look forward to hearing all your thoughts about the A7R III, the D850 and the Z7. These cameras are all very finely matched, and all three cameras I've now been using for anywhere between 3 months and 1.5 years.